Hi, I'm Zachary Hunter, and welcome to the Explain It to Me podcast. EITM pod is about info without gatekeeping and encouraging curiosity, community, and education without drowning in jargon. This is the final part of my X-Men and mutant-related podcast miniseries. And like I did with Doctor Who, I wanted to say a few quick words and give some idea of where the show will go next. I started this series asking, what is the X-Men? I give a few suggestions. One, a literal historical answer. Comic book, Stanley, Jack Kirby. Two, the mutant metaphor for marginalized groups, slash just being a teenager in a confusing world. And three, as a political and corporate football that has led to some wild editorial direction over the years, across both comics and on film. I ran with the idea and I settled on a fourth approach. It is, to me, about a conversation regarding Xavier's dream. Since I recorded that video, several X books have debuted with the From the Ashes era, with varied takes on what's left of that dream post Krakoa. And more are coming out in the coming weeks, as of the time of this recording. And there is already a lot I could say, but if you're interested in what other people have to say on other podcasts, specifically about the X-Men, more generally, the top three are all worth mentioning. First, there's Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men. Explain is X-Plain. Jay and Miles have been slowly working through X-Men history from the beginning for 7 years now, putting out new episodes almost every week. During those 7 years, they have divorced and civilly remarried other people. But they remain terrific partners if you want to dive deeper into, as they call it, comics' greatest superhero soap opera. On a similar note, there is, for second, the much more character-focused show. Instead of all of continuity and order, as with Jay and Miles, called Cerebro or Cerebro Files. It's hosted by a man named Connor Goldsmith. And if you're interested in discussions of minority representation and or sex and gender aspects of the X-Men, that show might be for you. However, if you do not want LGBTQ or non-white perspectives regarding the X-Men, might I suggest Battle of the Atom by Zach Jenkins and Adam Reck. Reck is spelled R-E-C-K, as I understand it. In that podcast, they discuss and rank X-Men stories in sort of themed groups of 3 stories per episode. They've done well over 300 episodes at this point, not counting interviews and things like that. So they're getting close to 1,000 stories, ranked best to worst. Well, what about what I think? Well, some of you may have noticed, though I did try to keep my editorial hat as straight as I could on these episodes, that I find Magneto and Quentin Quire to be fascinating characters. They both have been terrible people at various times, but usually in ways that are tragically all too human. Likewise, while I do not belong or identify as many of the groups represented on X-Team rosters, or from the groups of X-Men fans that have the interesting things to say on Cerebro, for example, one of the things I love about X-Men is how diverse groups and perspectives fit within that world. There have been times where the comic has had a hard time, even before it was owned by Disney and had far more shareholders to respond to, of always representing more radical viewpoints, or being fair to them. But unlike Star Trek, which I love, I was a Trekkie before I was a Whovian, so Star Trek before Doctor Who. There are conversations that can exist in X-Men comics that just couldn't occur on the bridge of the Enterprise, namely religion, which is a topic I care a lot about. Nightcrawler's Catholicism, Colossus, as a child of the Soviet Union's atheism, and Kitty Pryde's conservative or perhaps Reform Judaism were all addressed in comics, especially under Chris Claremont, in many ways that weren't always expected then or even now. When the X-Men fought Dracula, the Magen David, the Star of David that Kitty Pryde wore, worked the way a crucifix does normally in vampire stories. That's because it was a symbol of faith for her. Well, contrast that with Star Trek, which has for 60 years now, largely because of Gene Roddenberry's vision, had almost a requirement that humans do not have visible or vocalized religion and remain good guys or not shown in a negative light. All four quadrants of the Milky Way are available to boldly go into now. But there are many stories in Star Trek where if someone has a non-secular interior life, that they best be wearing nose or ear makeup. Vulcans can have religion. The Bajorans, and especially in Deep Space Nine, but also in the later seasons of Star Trek Next Generation, have a aspect of post-Holocaust Judaism, along with some other aspects, that only works for people that have religion. In that case, it's the prophets, who are generally shown as some sort of alien. But that level of faith for Homo sapiens, that's not the case for X-Men. Because even with cases like John Proudstar, aka the first Thunderbird from the all-new, all-different era, where indigenous religion was there was things left to be desired in how they were represented. There was still it was on the page in a way that it often isn't. I'm a huge Daredevil fan, but Matt Murdock, Daredevil, his Catholicism is heavily tied up with mostly Frank Miller's understanding of how would a person be able to be a law-abiding attorney during the day and a crime-fighting vigilante at night, and also the dichotomy of religious person who dresses up like a devil. But in X-Men, even more than many other comics, because anybody could be a mutant, you can have stories about any sort of person becoming a mutant. And that means it also comes along with everything they bring to the table. There's a character named Maggot, who is South African. And he's clearly, when first introduced, written as a late / early post-apartheid character. And there are stories about that you just can't do. You can do allegories, and it is, in some respects, a metaphor, the mutant metaphor. But at its best, it is people having a conversation about how do we live in a world where there are Asgardian gods flying in the sky and World War II super soldiers flinging the American flag all over the place on an indestructible shield. And yet, this person's not acceptable because they walk through walls. It's an interesting story where you can examine all sorts of personalities and parts of those people. And that's what makes this franchise something different, especially different than other major comic book franchises and sections of the world. Avengers isn't about change, but in many ways rather preserving, or I guess avenging, the status quo if it ever does change. X-Men, however, is literally based on evolution and social issues. As I mentioned in my first video, Stan Lee seems to have exaggerated somewhat how much the civil rights movement was actually affecting his original vision of X-Men, but it doesn't change the fact that, especially by the time Chris Claremont is writing, it is absolutely part of the comic. The goals of these characters are different in X-Men comics versus the Avengers. The Justice League fights against all sorts of enemies, including giant mind-controlling starfish, but it rarely has comics about the relationship drama between the teammates. The nature of some of the conflicts are different. Villains like Darkseid, Galactus, and so many others aren't ones that you ever think could be right, like Quentin Quire's shirt said of Magneto, and later when he was outlawed, Cyclops. But the positions are understandable and able to be argued. Not the genocide or the racism, obviously, but the methods and approaches mutants should take to prevent those things. Be it antagonism, be it grinning and bearing it, being and defending a world that hates and fears them, buying them off through a form of capitalism that makes sure that some of them are saved, similar to Emma Frost. The way X-Men is about a conversation over a dream, a dream of mutant survival, yet alone how they would interact with their fellow humans, is what makes it different. At its best, X-Men, and I'm including all the spin-offs, is about found family, but that's elsewhere. It is about really crazy time travel stories, but that's definitely elsewhere. I've done videos on Doctor Who. X-Men, though, at its heart, what makes it different isn't just that it is a soap opera, but it is X-Men isn't about where you come from. It's how where you come from changes the conversations that you're in afterwards. Your identity is based on where you come from, but also the one you make from it. It is about dealing with tragedy and horrors and surprises along the way. It is about the intense feelings that come along with scary situations and people who accept you when you were not accepted before or reject you when they have no reason to. It is canvas which you can make pictures, in this case, usually on a 9x9 grid with, you know, very bright colors and fantastic penciling. You can tell stories that are ones that aren't really the same kind of superhero comics that mainstream comics usually puts out. Chris Claremont realized it's a soap opera, not another Avengers book. Grant Morrison figured out it's not even really a superhero book. It is something different. Grant Morrison wrote Fantastic Justice League, run called JLA, around the same time as his X-Men, as their X-Men. But those are very different books because the X-Men, at its best, is a different book. The reason why I talked so much about Excalibur was because, yeah, it's goofy, it's romantic, it's funny, it's so very British. Some of it didn't age well. A lot of things in comics, a lot of things in media don't. In God Loves Man Kills, Kitty Pryde uses a word that she definitely shouldn't, and it gets reprinted, and it's there's plenty of articles online you can hear about what she said and conversations around it. In the end, that's what it's about. The conversations. People finding community and trying to figure out how to find their way through those communities. And also how to deal with the communities that they don't belong to. I hope these 5 episodes asking in various forms what is the X-Men helped you learn a little bit about Marvel's mutants. That this little Mutant 101 miniseries was interesting. And if it wasn't, maybe the next few episodes will be more your cup of tea, as they will be different. My next episode is going to be personal finance related again, as was my first real episode, which, if you want to go back and check out, is, I think, a pretty good one, even though it's very rough. Specifically, what I want to ask about is what is home buying? And I thought I would do something different this time. I want to ask you to email me, if you would, eitmpod@gmail.com. Links in the description. It's eitmpod@gmail.com. Or you can just comment below if you're on YouTube, for example, any questions you may have on this new topic. They can be broad. Don't worry, I won't judge. I'd want to have a conversation. That's what this is. It's info without gatekeeping. And I hope you come back for that episode and everything I have planned after that. So if you don't want to miss those episodes, please subscribe so we can grow EITM, because that's how the algorithm works. It needs constantly fed. Likewise, if you could, please tell your friends about the show. If you've seen these other videos, I have gotten better at this, and I intend to keep trying and trying to give you the information that you might find interesting or helpful, or just I don't want you to feel like you have to be in the personal finance space and constantly watching the guys who are often grifters to understand basic things. I don't want you to not have a resource where you can just, you know, spend tens of minutes here and there figuring out what is going on with X-Men in that general sense. And whatever topics you want me to discuss, as long as I have any ability to either research it or already know about it, if you have questions or suggestions on future topics, I can be reached at eitmpod@gmail.com. It's eitmpod@gmail.com. Also, since I am trying to grow the show, if you're willing to help monetarily, you can go over to kofi.com/EITMpod. It's ko-fi.com/EITMpod and contribute there. Either way, and until next time, please stay safe out there. God bless. Thanks for your time.